Well, all right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. I now have a pen in my hand because I tried to make the last video without anything in my hands, and I was losing my mind. I can't have this much freedom. So, anyway, today, in the last video, we talked about China. I'm trying to keep these videos like in more pieces and shorter ones for the sake of making them load easier. But anyway, so the last time, we talked about China for about 20 minutes. We're probably going to take, I don't know, we'll see what it winds up being, but probably about 10 minutes. Just kind of look at some other developments in Asia before we kind of turn our attention to the mood of the Western world on the verge of World War II. So in India, if you remember, India was kind of considered the jewel of the British Empire. It was probably the most profitable of all of these colonies that Britain had had. It had been a very important part of their economy for a very long time. But of course, the Indians had some problems with British rule. First off, the British could be a little bit snobby, and so the Indians are being treated as second-class citizens in their own home country. And you can imagine how resentment would build after time with that. And so India begins to, the people of India start to kind of raise their voice a little bit more against the British and ask for more self-government. The British responded by passing a law that kind of put in place like a plan to, on paper, slowly phase India into more self-government, give them a little bit more control over this, that, and the other. A lot of Indians sign up to go fight in World War I because obviously Britain's at war, and a lot of the leaders of India thought if a lot of us go and fight in the war, then they'll want to reward our faithfulness in the war with independence or more control. But those who thought that were very disappointed because they get back from the war and people don't, the British don't really honor any of these promises right away. And so, or at all. So you start to have a little bit of a protest movement arose. The British Parliament responded by passing a set of laws that were kind of intended to work against an emerging protest movement. And so, the Indians protested the anti-protest law by trying to hold a political rally at a place called Amritsar. Let me make sure I'm pronouncing that correct. Yes, Amritsar. And, of course, the thing that's really concerned the British about this Amritsar rally was that it actually involved Hindus and Muslims together. And up until this time, because of historical rivalries between the Hindu and Muslim populations in India, the British never really feared them kind of working as a united front until they see this crowd at Amritsar, and it kind of spooks them. There's some conflicting accounts about how much, did the British think that they were clearly violating the law, or the Indians confused about what the law was against a rally? Either way, it wasn't a good law in human rights perspective that would have prevented them from having a political rally, even if it was against the law, quote unquote. So anyway, long story short, at this big rally, you've got all these Indians gathered together to protest the British rule, and then the British soldiers opened fire, and a lot of innocent Indians who were just coming to make their case for self-rule die. And specifically, let me check the statistics here. I'm sorry, I got tired of holding this book that's 8,000 pounds. It's a shame that it's so big, really. My American history book is nice because they actually split it into two, and so you can you just have two teacher's editions, but this one, no dice. You just gotta lug this massive thing around. You normally have a podium, but I haven't had a podium for a month, so. Anyway, so yeah, Amritsar, you wind up with 400 dead, 1,200 wounded. Not a good deal. And so the Amritsar massacre overnight converts a lot of fit-sitting or even pro-British Indians into the nationalist camp. And at this point in time, the movement is on for independence. And the most important leader to emerge of the Indian independence movement is a fellow by the name of Mohandas Gandhi, who you may know by the name Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma was a name that means great soul. And that was a name that was kind of given to him as an honorific. And Gandhi is a very important person in 20th century history. He was a major influence on a number of international figures, most notably Martin Luther King Jr., who very much modeled his style of how he led the American civil rights movement based on Gandhi's idea. He was a major admirer of Gandhi. And so Gandhi advocated for a path of nonviolent resistance. He did not want like an armed rebellion against the British government. He was a pacifist, believed in nonviolence. Instead, what he called for was civil disobedience, followed by passively accepting whatever penalty was laid upon you and hoping that your unjust suffering would turn people's hearts in your direction and change public opinion in your favor over time. And so, those that were under Gandhi's leadership, they weren't making riots happen, and, they weren't looting and breaking store windows and shooting at soldiers or anything like that. They would protest. When the British told them not to protest, they would keep doing it. They would lock them in jail. They would, they would throw them in jail with not enough food, bad conditions, blah, blah, blah. And then the newspapers would start printing stories about them holding these political dissidents prisoner. And people would start to be like, England, aren't we supposed to be the good guys? I thought we were like one of the birthplaces of representative government. Why are we being so cruel to these people? Because Britain was obviously not being the good guy in India, but they would have thought of themselves in that way, certainly in the war with the Germans that they just got out of, right? So, so Gandhi and his nonviolent resistance is really able to kind of turn the hearts of the world to look at the British and be like, what are you doing, England? It really kind of convinces them that, ultimately what they've been doing, was wrong. One of the things that was most famous was something called the Salt March. So this was a moment where they actually passed a law saying that you could only buy salt from the British government. And so the Indians under Gandhi protested this by literally marching from the middle of the country to the sea and getting a bunch of salt water out of the ocean and letting it dry until it was just salt left, as a way to say, if we can do without salt. If we have to get salt from the ocean, we'll do it. The primary weapon that Gandhi used, to have an impact on the British was the weapon of the boycott, which was basically refusal to buy or sell goods with the disfavored group. So they said, we're not going to sit by, a lot of the Indians that were aligned with Gandhi's movement refused to buy or sell British goods. And so that meant a lot of people factories couldn't run because people were refusing to work for factories that are going to build products that go over to England. And so this starts to have a big deal. This starts to be a big deal to the British because, the economy is going to suffer if half the people are just staying home and not working. Not that anyone knows anything about that right now. So ultimately, they're kind of starting to put a hurt on the British, bank account balance, In addition to that, you're starting to have to throw more people in jail than the jails can hold. And then there's these stories many times. Lots of these people are getting arrested. Tens of thousands of Indian protesters are getting arrested. And oftentimes, the soldiers are getting baited into doing things like beating them with clubs, and, very violence against them. And they're not fighting back. They're letting people use violence against them and just taking it in hopes that it would spur sympathy. And it begins to succeed. There's a particularly bad incident that was witnessed by some American journalist of the British clubbing Gandhi and some of his followers really bad. And he goes into prison. He often would go on extended hunger strikes. He really wanted to teach... There's a fly buzzing around, sorry. He really wanted to teach... the idea of Indian self-reliance, of not needing to rely on the British colonial masters. And so one thing he did was, he literally would dedicate an hour or two of his day to sewing his own garments so that he wouldn't have to buy British clothes. And so that became a model for a lot of Indians. Started doing that after his example, and so ultimately this does actually work. It's going to take a little bit of time before they see it fully, but Britain does agree to a law that would start building toward Indian independence, and India is going to become a nation of her own shortly following World War II. Now, the storm cloud on the horizon, though, is that a lot of the Indian Muslims are very concerned because they think, right now the British don't really care about our Muslim-Hindu feuds, but if you have a democracy come into India with representative government, it's probably going to have a Hindu majority, because that's the majority of the Indian people. And would a Hindu majority legislature actually be fair to the rights of Muslims, or would this turn into, potentially civil war and persecution? And so a lot of the Muslims are starting to get concerned about this whole plan. So hold that thought. We'll come back to that in a week or two, when India does get their independence, and we'll kind of see how that plays out. So, anyway, turning our attention to some other parts of the East, moving to the Middle East, we mentioned that the Treaty of Versailles and the associated treaties, Versailles actually only dealt with Germany. There was another treaty that dealt with the Turks, but the treaties that ended World War I very much set up the modern Middle East. Because the Ottoman Empire, that old Turkish empire that had lasted for centuries, that had brought down the Byzantine Empire. Remember Byzantium, right? That was a long time ago. They're the ones that bring down Byzantium at the Battle of Actium, and here they are still in charge of the Middle East at the beginning of World War I. Well, the Ottoman Empire and the Sultan are going to fall to pieces at the end of World War I. And ultimately, the leader that comes to power is a man by the name of, a Turkish general by the name of Mustafa Kemal, who is now known as Ataturk, which is an honorary name. It means the father of the Turks. And so Kemal, or Ataturk, kind of has some ideas about the direction he wants to take the new independent nation of Turkey, which is no longer the sprawling empire that it once was, but is more confined to a smaller space there on the Mediterranean. Parts of it are in Asia, parts of it are in Europe. The two main things that Ataturk wanted were increased secularization and modernization. So, for instance, a lot of people in Turkey, it's traditional to wear a hat known as the fez. Perhaps you've seen this make an appearance before. And, it would have, I don't know if you can see, it's got like a little tail thing on the side of it here. And so this was kind of the traditional hat that a lot of the Turkish people would have worn. Kemal, though, not a fan. He wants Turkey to become like a European country. He wants to be a country more like the Western world. So he actually bans the poor fez. Sorry. Literally makes it illegal to wear it. I mean, illegalizes a lot of the traditional Turkish dress, as well as some of Islamic garb as well. And although Turkey remained an overwhelmingly Muslim nation, he wanted the government to be relatively secularized compared to how it has been. So he actually separated the Islamic law from the written constitution of Turkey, which was kind of modeled after European governments. And he began trying to build up a new industrial base and kind of industrialize his country. So Turkey becomes a very different country for a matter of several decades. Although they're kind of changing course away from some of that secularization in recent years. Meanwhile, in the land of the Arabian Peninsula, a new nation is founded called Saudi Arabia, named after an extraordinarily wealthy family known as the Sauds, founder or patriarch Ibn Saud, who winds up being crowned king of the land of Saudi Arabia. And some of this was in response to, we mentioned this when we talked about World War I, some of this was in response to the promises that the British made to the Arab revolutionaries if they would help them overthrow the Ottomans. Ultimately, Saudi Arabia becomes an independent monarchy, and they're still one of the last standing, like, old school traditional monarchies. It still passes the kingdom down to from father to son to father to son, and so on. And really a lot of and we'll see when we talk in a second about how they find oil in the Middle East and how big of a deal that is. Because of these oil revenues, the Saudi royal family is one of the wealthiest families in the world, and many of the richest people in the world are heirs of that Saudi royal family. Meanwhile, the country that has traditionally through most of its history been known as Persia actually takes a new name. It renames itself Iran. And it comes under the leadership of a new type of leader known as, that they called the Shah, which is essentially just another word for monarch. It's another word like Tsar or Sultan or whichever, Kaiser, whatever name you want. But in Iran they call them the Shah, and in this case the Shah's the Shah's name was Reza Khan. Hold on, let me make sure. I'm trying to keep my Pahlavis straight. Yeah, Reza Shah Pahlavi. Later on, there's another Shah who's Reza Khan Pahlavi. But anyway, so Reza Shah Pahlavi becomes the leader of Iran. One thing that, and they also modernize. We think of Iran now as a very oppressive Islamic theocratic regime. And it's been that way since 1979. But in actuality, between World War I and 79, Iran was actually a very modern and contemporary country. If you go back and look at photos of, the Iranian nightly news in the 1970s, you would think it was the news from New York or Los Angeles or something like that. But now it looks very different, And so Iran emerges, Saudi Arabia emerges, independent Turkey emerges. One thing that's important to know about all this stuff is that the Middle East is forever changed by the growth of the oil industry. And, oil has been important for a long time because oil was how people, that's what they used for light before electricity. But now, in the 20s and 30s, you've got this massive increase in the use of the automobile, which completely starts changing cultures in profound ways. And the move toward the kind of post-automobile economy and way of life requires lots of oil. And because of that, the countries that are rich in oil, which most of these Middle Eastern countries are, certainly Saudi Arabia is, certainly Iran is, certainly countries like the United Arab Emirates and Qatar are, they start being able to rake in the money. And this has made the Saudi Arabian government in particular extraordinarily wealthy. So finding oil in the Middle East is a big, big deal that makes the Middle East a very important part of the world, really for the remainder of the course. So that's kind of how things are going on in South Asia. We'll come back real quick in a minute and kind of show you how things are going in Europe and America.